The sound of pots and pans banging in the street. December 2001, Argentina's president flees the presidential palace by helicopter, running from his own citizens. But let me ask you something first. Do you know how many times this country has defaulted on its debt? 9 times. Can you believe that? This is the story of Messi's country, Argentina. Let's go back 100 years. In 1913, the average person here earned more than the average French person, more than the average German. A top 10 global economy. Back then, people around the world didn't dream of the American dream. They dreamed of the Argentine dream instead. So what does Argentina look like today? Annual inflation over 200%. 9 sovereign defaults. Half the population living below the poverty line. How does the richest country in the world end up here? Stick around to the end and you'll find out. And here's a hint. What destroyed this country wasn't poverty. It was the opposite. Wealth that came too easily. Let's rewind further to the 1880s, when the world first turned its attention to this vast land at the southern tip of South America. The reason was the land itself, the Pampas, one of the most fertile stretches of farmland on Earth. At the same time, Europe's population was exploding under industrialization. Britain's population tripled in a century. Germany's more than doubled. More people and not enough food to feed them. Argentina seized the opportunity. 15 days by ship from Europe and endless farmland waiting. Then came the technology that changed everything: refrigerated shipping. In 1877, the first shipment of frozen Argentine beef arrived safely in France. Before that, meat could only be dried or salted for the journey. Now, fresh beef could reach European tables directly. London's finest restaurants rushed to put Argentine beef on their menus. From 1870 to 1914, Argentina grew at over 6% a year on average, a pace that rivals China's growth today. Buenos Aires, Argentina's capital, quickly earned a nickname: the Paris of South America. Grand theaters, wide boulevards, and monumental buildings rose one after another. In 1908, the Teatro Colón opened its doors. At the time, one of the largest opera houses in the world. Famous European singers crossed the Atlantic just to perform on its stage. Behind all this prosperity were the immigrants. The Argentine government threw its doors open to the entire world. Come, anyone. We'll even pay your fare. The population went from 1.08 million in 1870 to 7.8 million by 1914, more than sevenfold in 44 years. Italian farmers brought advanced agricultural techniques. German immigrants brought brewing know-how. The French brought winemaking. All these cultures blended together and produced something entirely new, including the tango. By 1913, Argentina's GDP per capita had overtaken both France and Germany. It was a top 10 global economy. The Buenos Aires Stock Exchange was the 3rd largest in the world, after London and New York. British capital alone poured over £2 billion into the country, more than Britain had invested in the whole of India. European newspapers at the time predicted, the 20th century will belong to Argentina. But there was a crack no one was watching closely. In the United States, land was divided among countless small farmers. Argentina was different. A small handful of large landowners controlled everything, the so-called estancia system. A few hundred families owned more than 80% of all farmland. The top 300 families controlled 60% of the nation's entire wealth. These families never needed to compete. They already had a monopoly. They had no interest in innovation or improving productivity. Money poured in even when they farmed carelessly on their vast estates. From the outside, everything looked magnificent. But underneath, this country was standing on a single chair leg, and that leg was agriculture. On October 24th, 1929, on Wall Street in New York, you can hear that leg begin to crack. October 1929. The stock market crash on Wall Street, Black Thursday, sent shockwaves through the entire world. But one country absorbed the blow harder than almost anyone else: Argentina. For 50 years, this nation had bet everything on agricultural exports. Overnight, global demand collapsed and prices hit rock bottom. The beef and wheat this country had once taken so much pride in simply stopped selling. The bigger problem was that agriculture was all this country had. For half a century, the belief that farming alone is enough had left every other industry neglected. The United States and Germany were hit by the Depression too, but they had automobiles, steel, chemicals, a real manufacturing base to fall back on. Argentina didn't. The chair that had looked so magnificent was standing on one leg, and that leg had just snapped. In 1930, exports fell 40% in a single year. Unemployment shot past 20% almost overnight. As the economy shook, politics collapsed along with it. That September, the military staged a coup and toppled the democratic government, claiming they would solve the crisis, though they had no real plan of their own. Throughout the 1930s, Argentina stayed trapped in political chaos and economic stagnation. People called it the lost decade. The rest of the world was moving fast. Argentina stood still. America clawed its way out with the New Deal. Germany rearmed. Even neighboring Brazil began breaking free of its dependence on coffee exports and building up manufacturing. But Argentina kept clinging to its past glory, telling itself that agricultural prices would surely rise again. Then, in the early 1940s, amid all this chaos, one man steps onto the political stage. His name was Juan Domingo Perón. Born in 1895 to a poor ranch manager, he trained at military school and became a career soldier. But in the 1930s, on a training trip to Europe, something else caught his attention. How Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany had won the loyalty of their people. Perón was especially struck by how popular they became through policies aimed at workers. In 1943, Perón joined a military coup and rose to become Secretary of Labor in the new government. This is where his real ambition started to show. He took a completely different path from the politicians before him. Not politics for the elite, politics for the working class. He declared himself on the side of the descamisados, the shirtless ones, the poorest of the poor. His logic was simple. Argentina's problem is that we've depended too much on the world economy. We've only sold raw materials abroad and relied on foreign capital. Now, we must become fully self-sufficient. In February 1946, Perón won the presidential election with a commanding 56% of the vote. Overwhelming support from urban workers and rural laborers alike. The moment he took office, Perón began tearing the country apart and rebuilding it. He nationalized core infrastructure, railways, telephones, gas, electricity, and pushed out British and American companies one by one. He slapped heavy tariffs on foreign goods to block imports. Buy Argentine, not foreign, became his motto. For workers, he delivered something almost unheard of. Wages up more than 50%, paid vacation introduced, a legal 48-hour work week. Pensions expanded dramatically. At the time, Argentine workers had the highest wages and benefits anywhere in Latin America, better even than some countries in Europe. And then there was his wife, Eva Perón. People called her Evita. Born into rural poverty, she'd worked as an actress in Buenos Aires from a young age. After marrying Perón, she became a driving force behind women's rights and social welfare. In 1947, she helped pass a law granting women the right to vote. She built resorts for workers, schools, and hospitals for poor children. Every week, she met citizens in person at the vice presidential residence, listening to their struggles. To Argentina's working class, the Peróns weren't just a president and first lady. They were a symbol of hope itself. On July 9, 1947, Independence Day, Perón made a declaration. We are now fully independent, not just politically, but economically. On the surface, it looked convincing. While World War II left Europe in ruins, Argentina was riding a wartime boom. Exports of both farm goods and manufactured products surged. Foreign currency reserves swelled. Perón poured this money into massive public works projects. But behind this dazzling facade, a fatal flaw was hiding, one that almost no one noticed at the time. Here's what that flaw was. After World War II, the global economy entered an unprecedented boom, expanding free trade and international specialization. Argentina, alone, kept its doors shut. While other nations competed with each other, advancing technology and boosting productivity, Argentine companies grew comfortable behind their government's protective wall. With no need to compete internationally, there was no reason to innovate. Bit by bit, but unmistakably, this country's products lost their competitive edge. By the early 1950s, storm clouds were gathering over Argentina's economy. The core problem was money. Sustaining Perón's promised high wages and sweeping welfare programs required enormous funding. But the economy wasn't growing the way it needed to. Protectionist policy was actually making things less efficient. Argentine goods got worse in quality while getting more expensive, until eventually they could only be sold domestically. The bigger problem was that Argentina was becoming isolated from the entire global economic current. The 1950s are remembered worldwide as a golden age of explosive growth. Western Europe rose from the ashes of war with help from the Marshall Plan. Japan laid the groundwork for its own rapid rise. Even South Korea and Taiwan began growing quickly through export-driven industrialization. But Argentina remained locked inside protectionism, with almost no foreign investment coming in. On July 26, 1952, Evita, this country's greatest source of hope, died of uterine cancer. She was just 33 years old. Her death sent shockwaves through the entire nation. More than 2 million people attended her funeral. The line to view her body stretched for dozens of kilometers. Evita hadn't just been a president's wife. To the poor, she had been something closer to a mother. With her death, the symbolic heart of Peronism disappeared too. Perón never fully recovered from the loss. His political judgment grew clouded. As the economy worsened, his rule grew more authoritarian, suppressing the press, crushing opposition. In 1954, he clashed head-on with the Catholic Church, legalizing divorce and banning religious education. In a country that had always been devoutly Catholic, this ignited fierce backlash from conservatives. In June 1955, the Argentine Navy and Air Force bombed the capital, Buenos Aires, the opening shot of a coup against the government. That first attempt failed. But that September, the military finally succeeded, and Perón was overthrown. He fled into exile in Paraguay. For the next 18 years, he would never again set foot on Argentine soil. But this is where Argentina's real tragedy begins. Because Perón was gone, but Peronism wasn't. Under the banner of the Liberating Revolution, the military that ousted Perón tried to tear Peronism out by its roots. Even speaking his name was banned. People were jailed simply for possessing his photograph. They even smuggled Evita's body out of the country in secret. But this heavy-handed approach backfired completely. Peronist resistance only grew fiercer, and Argentine society split apart in a way that would never fully heal. The problem was that Peronists still made up more than half the population. Urban workers and rural laborers in particular hadn't forgotten the high wages and welfare they'd enjoyed under Perón. They waited for his return and refused to truly accept any government that wasn't his. Meanwhile, the middle class, intellectuals, and the military branded Peronism as fascism, something that could never be tolerated. Split into two hostile camps, Argentine politics fell into a complete vicious cycle. A civilian government would take power. Peronists would paralyze the country with strikes and protests. The military would stage another coup in the name of restoring order. But when the military government also failed to fix the economy, public backlash would force power back to civilians, and the same pattern would repeat. From 1955 to 1983, 28 years, Argentina never escaped this loop. Entering the 1960s, things got even more complicated. Radical leftist ideology began spreading among younger Peronists. Inspired by the success of the Cuban Revolution, they tried to spark a socialist uprising through armed struggle. Guerrilla groups like the Montoneros and the Revolutionary Army emerged. Operating under Perón's name, they kidnapped government officials and assassinated foreign businessmen. In 1970, the Montoneros shocked the country by kidnapping and executing former President Pedro Aramburu. Comparing Argentina to other nations during this period reveals just how severe the decline had become. In 1950, Argentina's GDP per capita was more than 3 times that of Japan. By 1970, Japan had overtaken it entirely. The gap with European nations like Italy and Spain widened further, and even rising Asian economies, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, began catching up. A country that had once ranked among the world's top 12 economies was steadily sliding toward the margins. On July 1, 1974, Perón died of a heart attack. He was 79. The death of Argentina's last remaining hope plunged the nation into despair. But there was a bigger problem. His successor was his third wife, Isabel Perón. Isabel had been a nightclub dancer with almost no political experience or ability. Having become vice president, she inherited the presidency almost by accident. She carried the symbolic weight of being the world's first female president, but had no capacity whatsoever to solve the crisis Argentina now faced. The Isabel Perón era was, quite literally, hell. Armed clashes between leftist guerrillas and right-wing paramilitaries became routine, and dozens died every single day. Groups like the Montoneros kept up their terror campaign in the name of true Peronist revolution, while the government fought back with a right-wing paramilitary force called the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance. Gunfights in the streets of Buenos Aires and bombings became an everyday occurrence. In 1975 alone, more than 1,500 people died from political violence. The economy was even worse. The Isabel government, claiming to solve the crisis, simply printed more money, and inflation hit 600% annually in 1975. That meant prices doubled every single month. People raced to spend their paychecks the moment they got them. Waiting even one day meant the same money bought half as much. Lifetime savings evaporated overnight. Doctors, teachers, civil servants, white-collar professionals commonly turned to driving taxis or street vending just to survive. You could see university professors selling hamburgers outside their own schools. The middle class, once Argentina's pride, began to collapse. By late 1975, Isabel Perón's approval rating had fallen to around 10%. All of Argentine society had become a powder keg, waiting for a spark. And in the early hours of March 24, 1976, the military moved again. But this coup would be unlike any that came before it. It wasn't just about seizing power. It was a plan to rebuild the entire country from scratch. At first, many citizens applauded. Finally, they thought, this chaos will end. But within just a few months, people realized what exactly they'd welcomed. Under the pretext of hunting down leftist guerrillas, the government began rounding up students, journalists, lawyers, even members of the clergy. These people disappeared without trial. The exact number is still debated, but estimates range from 10,000 to 30,000 who vanished during this period. Imagine if your family member disappeared one day and no one would tell you why. That was the reality for a group of mothers. Starting in 1977, these mothers gathered every Thursday in the plaza, standing in silence. No words, just photographs of their missing children held up. This is how the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo began. But here's a twist almost no one saw coming. This same repressive junta swung completely in the opposite direction on economic policy. They tore down Perón's protectionism and threw the market wide open. In theory, this might have been the right direction, but the timing was disastrous. In 1979, the United States suddenly raised interest rates sharply. Developing nations around the world began collapsing like dominoes, and Argentina was no exception. Within a few years, foreign debt nearly doubled, while unemployment and inflation surged simultaneously. When an economy is collapsing like this, can you guess what a regime does next? Exactly. They start looking for something else to grab the public's attention. In April 1982, the junta suddenly invaded the Falkland Islands, a small archipelago home to just 1,800 sheep farmers. And at first, this gamble worked perfectly. The whole country poured into the streets as if they'd won a soccer championship. Support for the military shot past 80% overnight. The problem was, this junta had picked the wrong opponent: Britain's Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Her nickname, the Iron Lady, wasn't just for show. Britain sent an entire fleet, including aircraft carriers, halfway around the world to fight back. The result was devastating. Outdated equipment, insufficient training. Argentina's forces stood no chance. The war ended in just 74 days. 649 Argentine soldiers lost their lives. And that 80% approval rating? It collapsed to around 10%. This one war cost the military regime whatever legitimacy it had left. In 1983, democracy finally returned. When a new president, Raúl Alfonsín, took office, citizens believed better days were finally coming. But let me ask you something. What exactly did Alfonsín inherit? A shattered economy, a divided society, and $45 billion in foreign debt. This country's real trial was only just beginning. The government attempted a currency reform. At first, it seemed to work. But the underlying problem, not enough money, and no one willing to tighten their belt, never went away. Eventually, the government fell back on the same old solution: printing more money. And from here, Argentina would experience something that belongs in the history books. Prices rose by the day. Supermarket staff had to repaint price tags several times a day. Restaurants stopped printing prices on menus entirely, just today's rate instead. Wedding venues stopped accepting pesos altogether. Paid in pesos, no one could know how much value would be lost by the actual wedding day. If you got paid today, what would you do with the money? For Argentines back then, there was only one answer: run. Pull the cash out of the bank and convert it into goods as fast as possible. Wait even a day, and the same money bought half as much. By 1989, all of this reached its peak. Annual inflation hit 5,000%, meaning prices doubled roughly every 72 days. People eventually gave up on money altogether and turned to bartering. Then, in late May, everything that had been building finally broke. Hungry citizens began raiding supermarkets. 2 days of rioting left 14 people dead. President Alfonsín ultimately stepped down 6 months before his term ended, the first democratically elected president in Argentine history to leave office without completing his term. The people of what had once been the richest country in the world were now rioting for bread. This was Argentina in 1989. But here's what almost no one expected. Out of these ashes, Argentina would rise. Once, miraculously. That story continues in part 2.